So to continue on to try and identify and figure out these factors that allow us to make sense of what an employment relationship is actually like. We've talked about context, the important contextual factors of product markets and labour markets. Today I want to move on to not external factors that affect the relationship, but the factors that are inside the parties to the relationship themselves. And here we're talking about ideology, what people believe, what their values are, how they feel about the other side, about what they feel is right to happen within an employment relationship. All of these factors affect how the interactions take place. They affect the level of trust that there is between one side and the other. They affect the level of friendliness. Now, there's a tendency to kind of talk about employment relationships in the abstract between the employer and the employees. But the day-to-day practice of employment relations is often taking place between representatives, management on the one side, and employee representatives, union representatives on the other. And so the actual human interactions between these people, between these agents within the employment relationship start to become very tangible, in the same way that a relationship between two people, normal romantic relationships, is affected by the way that the parties to that relationship engage with each other. These aspects of belief, of behaviour, have a very real impact upon how the relationship develops and the scope that the relationship has to develop into these conflictual or cooperative patterns that we've talked about previously. So what I want to do in this short video is just try and get a handle on what are the kind of key features of these ideological aspects to the employment relationship. Now, scholars in the employment relations tradition have been thinking about these issues for a long time. And so one of the ways that we can think about ideology is to go back to what we call management frames of reference: egoism, unitarism, pluralism, critical theory. All of these are rooted in assumptions that we carry with us, that we use to interpret the world around us, that tell us about what ought to be, about how things are, about how things really operate. They're not often evidence-based, they're just basic beliefs about how things work. So if you're a unitarist, you have a basic assumption that the most important, in fact the only legitimate interests within an organisation are those of the people who own it. Whereas if you're a pluralist, you believe that there are wider interests at stake, that might extend to the workforce, to a wider sense of community or whatever. These are beliefs. So the way in which parties to the employment relationship relate to each other is very strongly affected by these basic beliefs. If one side has one set of values and the other side has another set of values, in one way it's like speaking different languages. You know, they can be trying to communicate, trying to build a relationship, but they're speaking at cross purposes. They don't really get what each side means. And so that ability to not necessarily come together and share beliefs, although of course shared beliefs are a very strong foundation for an effective employment relationship, but to understand where each side is coming from is a very important aspect of employment relations practice. Not just to see the other side as some kind of evil, kind of plague, but to interpret what they're saying through an appropriate theoretical lens, so that you can make sense of where they're coming from. That if they are speaking about issues in a particular way, you can interpret that, make sense of it, and respond in kind. Respond in a way which allows you to engage with those ideas rather than just to reject them. So those that acknowledgement and understanding of the ideological stance or stances that are occurring within the employment relationship is very important. Having the framework to be able to do that is an important skill for an employment relations practitioner. And these things are important not just in terms of the way that parties engage with each other or the quality of the relationship, but because these things have an impact on the outcomes of employment relations processes. We see time and again that the orientation of parties qualitatively affects the kinds of employment relations outcomes that occur, whether that's a pay system, and we see this through studies of gain sharing schemes in the United States, or whatever. But the orientations of actors affects outcomes. And one of the key areas that this is apparent within is the degree of trust. Like I say, much of day-to-day employment relations isn't between the employer and employees. It's between representatives. And those representatives have to engage with each other. They have to compromise with each other. They have to be able to trust in each other's sincerity. To strike a deal, you have to believe that that deal is a real deal. It's not something that is a trick or a ruse or a ploy or something else. Trust is an important aspect, and Graham Dietz did a lot of work about what it is in trust that is important, and he talked about various dimensions of trust. And it can be very minimal, very maximal, but he talked about this important crossover point, what he called real trust, defined by the extent to which each side in the relationship begins to replace distrust with having kind of positive expectations about the other side. That if a move is made, it will be responded to appropriately, effectively, with consideration. And so trust, you can see how trust plays a part in the way that an employment relationship develops and allows effective outcomes to be achieved. Now, of course, what we're talking about there is about bargaining relationships, trust between bargainers, trust between representatives. But of course, they are just representatives. They aren't technically part of the employment relationship at all. The employment relationship exists between the employed and the employers. So there is a risk where the nature of the relationship between bargainers, between representatives, becomes detached from the actual values, expectations, beliefs of the people that they represent. What are the limits to that trust? What if it doesn't extend? What if it doesn't spread? What are the limits to the development of an effective relationship between bargainers when it is detached from employees in particular? Now, this is a very important issue to remember, particularly in the role that you're all going to have as bargainers, that as a representative within the relationship, within an employment relationship, when you're striking deals, you have to be able to bring your people with you. You have to be able to strike a deal that is going to be upheld by the people that you represent. And so you have to play that game quite carefully, to not move beyond what your people expect, to not behave in ways that is going to be interpreted as deceitful, that you're getting too close to the other side, that if you exhibit behaviour that is too friendly, too trusting, conceding too much to the other side, they may begin to distrust you, and your role, your effective role as a bargainer, as a representative, is limited. Now, probably the most detailed work on how this can play out was by Walter McKersey back in the 60s, who talked about a framework of relationship patterns, that we can make sense of the nature of the relationship in this way by identifying a variety of attitudinal dimensions. Now, one of those dimensions is one that we've already talked about. It's trust, but they also talk about friendliness. They also talk about legitimacy. How much legitimacy does one side grant the other? Are you regarded as some kind of fraud, somebody who's elbowed their way in where they're not really wanted, or are you regarded as an appropriate, legitimate voice within the relationship? And the final dimension that they talk about is motivational orientation. How much you're prepared to go out of your way, how much you're prepared to assist the other side in attempting to achieve their objectives, their interests. So taken together, these four attitudinal dimensions provide a way of making sense of the shape, the character of an employment relationship ideology across the piece. A very important analytical mechanism by which we can make sense of the scope, the potential of what can be achieved within that particular relationship. Now, the final thing that we might think about is that whilst we talked about these ideological aspects as factors that affect outcomes, or factors that we might use in a kind of analytical sense, these relationship patterns, the nature of the relationship between parties within employment, can also be regarded as an objective in their own right. That because employment relationships are long-standing, they go on for decades in some instances, individual parties to their relationship, bargaining representatives, engage with each other on an ongoing basis for years and years and years. And because of the way in which these relationship patterns enable certain kinds of outcomes, the type of relationship, the quality of that relationship, the nature of the ideological interaction that goes on between parties can become important objectives in their own right. And so it's important to think about this, not just as a kind of, okay, what's it like? Or what do I think, what do they think? But to think about how you might pursue a particular relationship pattern. Something that you might, just in just the same way that you might pursue a particular bargaining outcome in a more tangible sense, a particular pay level, a particular increase in this or that or the other, an improvement in the quality of the actual relationship may be seen as a legitimate and desirable thing for bargainers to aim for. And that's an important aspect to consider as part of this as well.